As we've read the Gospel of Luke throughout this year, we may have noticed the very many great demands that Jesus places on the disciples throughout. We had in Luke chapter 6 the passage, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." We had in Luke chapter 9 the passage where Jesus describes the homelessness of being a disciple. He said, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests to live in, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And in Luke chapter 14, he says quite clearly that no one can be his disciple unless they give up their own possessions. And he suggests that if anyone wants to be a disciple, they need to learn to count the cost. So I think it's against that backdrop that we now arrive in chapter 17, and Jesus is telling his disciples to be on guard, because if anyone causes a weaker person to stumble, it would be better for a millstone to be hung around their neck, and to forgive. Two incredibly difficult things. He says that if anyone sins against them, they are to forgive the sinner, no matter how often the cycle is repeated. And so I think the picture that's been painted for us throughout the Gospel of Luke is this picture of discipleship and following Jesus is not for the faint of heart. And I think we also see in the passage, I think it's fair to say, that the apostles by this time are overwhelmed. I certainly am. They respond by asking the Lord to please increase their faith. And I think their request reveals something interesting about their concept of faith. They ask for more of it, perhaps indicating that for the apostles, the concept of faith is something measurable, it's something quantifiable. And they want more, they want it increased. And true to form, Jesus answers in a rather strange way by using the example of a mustard seed. Matthew and Mark tell the mustard seed faith example a little differently. They really emphasize the size of a mustard seed being a very small, negligible thing that grows into a mighty tree. But here, I think what we're seeing is something about Jesus' concept, his view, that faith is not measured by quantity. Faith, when you compare it to a seed, is simply a presence. A seed produces life. A seed grows into a flourishing plant, not because it is enormous, but simply because it exists, and given the right conditions, it will produce life. So the disciples are busy asking for more faith. They want it to be increased, but God seems to be saying to us here something unexpected about faith, that it merely needs to exist. I sympathize with the disciples' request. I think it's a very sincere question. They're asking for the ability to believe and to trust and for strength to carry out this difficult life of being a disciple. And when we do feel like the disciples, when we want to believe but we feel we cannot, when we want to forgive but it is impossibly hard, when we want to have faith but it just doesn't feel like enough, what do we do? Some of you might be familiar with Blaise Pascal and his famous wager. He suggested in his wager that a person who's struggling to believe should visit church. They should take the holy water, participate in the Mass, and he says, I quote, "Belief will come and stupefy your scruples." I think for Pascal, Faith comes to us as gift, as generosity extended to us by a God who is always generous toward us. Faith comes through God's graces and through the sacraments, these signposts and landmarks that guide us to a place where we can receive. And if we put ourselves in the way of those gifts, like Pascal suggests, by going to the church and taking the holy water and participating in the Mass, if we put ourselves in the way of those gifts, we put ourselves in a space where we can receive, and those gifts come and stun us. That seed, Jesus' analogy for faith, falls to the ground, and it even dies, and what emerges stupefies our scruples. Reading and reflecting on this passage tonight, I love the disciples' request because it is very familiar to me and very relatable. At the moment, our church is in a bit of a season of transition, and I want more faith because I want to be sure and positive about this life of discipleship that I am trying, and we are all trying, and sometimes failing, to live together here in this community. And I think that being honest about grappling with the difficulty of believing is perhaps the best place to begin. It's, after all, in response to the disciples' honesty that Jesus reveals, albeit a little bit cryptically, something new and true about what faith actually is. Keep on forgiving, Jesus says, not because it makes sense or because you feel you have enough faith to keep on forgiving, but because forgiveness is part of the practice of being close to Jesus, of being in relationship. Rowan Williams writes in his book, Being Disciples, that faith appears not as a system or a comprehensive answer to all of your problems. It appears quite simply in the form of dependable relationship. You may not understand or have the words on the tip of your tongue, but you can learn somehow to be confident in a presence, an other who does not change or go away. And that is faith, I would say, in a very deeply biblical sense. Faith as dependable relationship is something other than faith as a system. And perhaps we could say tonight, after reading our gospel, faith as a dependable relationship is something other than faith as quantity, something to be measured or increased. Faith in this passage is something organic. It is a seed, it's a dynamic, it's a relationship. So to bring this all down to earth a bit, what does that mean to us in our day-to-day life if faith is a dynamic or a relationship? I think it means that faith is not merely something which we struggle to attain, we struggle to have more and more of, but rather something that we allow to wash over us. I thought of the example of relaxation or sleep. I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, but if you really, really try very hard to relax, or you try very hard to sleep, sometimes the trying can backfire. Sometimes the harder we try to grasp that by our own means, the more elusive it becomes. And I think what Rowan Williams is suggesting is that the more we allow ourselves to become dependent on this other, to raise our awareness of this love that will not let us go, as we sing in the hymn, the more aware we become of faith entering into us, faith being planted in us like a seed. And I think if we want our faith to grow, then those of us who are gathered here tonight are already on the right track. Being in a community of believers, as Pascal suggested, reading the scriptures, singing hymns together, participating in the liturgy. These are the rituals and the signposts that God has given us to sustain this faith. And that leads me to just one final point that I think is also sometimes overlooked, that faith is not an individual possession. It is something that is shared in and amongst a group of people. Seeds can't grow without nourishment. They can't grow without sun and soil and water and the right conditions of temperature and season. And faith is likewise fostered in an ecosystem that we call the church. So when we're struggling with our life of faith, we're never alone. Others have struggles as well. Faith, as Rowan Williams says, is this relationship of dependence. And the more we struggle together with vulnerability, with honesty, the more adept we become at depending on God and depending on one another. So gathering here in a community where we share that mutual struggle and our triumphs, our doubts, our fears, our longings, our celebrations, gathering in a community where we pray for things that we hardly dare to dream or hope for, we put ourselves in that way of receiving the gift of faith. And as Pascal says, it is here that belief will come and stupefy our scruples. Amen.